is running 12 or 16 hours of Zoom calls that slides just make life things difficult, right? Let me set some context for this, all right? And this is going to be a different approach from the previous presentation. And I don't want to see it to be seen as competitive because it's kind of like a precursor or has a different function. I'm not particularly, well, I'm interested because I like going to museums and libraries in the whole area about people's stories, their reflection, their remembrance, all of that sort of stuff I think is really important. My focus, however, is on lessons learned, citizen engagement, and also wider issues of public policy. I think one of the things we need to be very clear about is that COVID isn't going to be over anytime soon. I mean, the Melbourne story is one we're all quoting, but the US is, kind of like becoming a plague country, so is the UK. We now know that immunity is kind of like an issue, within COVID. And even if we forget about COVID, we're going to get other worse things coming through over the next few decades. And then we got the big one of global warming coming. So I've said for some time that COVID is a chance for us to get our act together as a species, and whether we're going to seize that or not is an open question. So let me just set some mainline agenda items. Firstly, I think I want to avoid the story word. We're interested in people's real-time observations, anecdotal data, observations in the field under fire. We're not as interested in reflective stories, although there's a process for reflection I'll come back to later. And there are various reasons for that. One is the very simple fact that the way people remember things after an event is different from what actually happened. So in the lessons learned environment, it's very dangerous to do sort of post hoc reflection. We did a body of work on this when I was in IBM, working with sales teams and recording effectively their retrospective before and after they knew whether they'd won the sale or not. And the stories they told were radically different. And it wasn't that they were lying, it's just that human memory changes. So we basically modify our memories of the past in order to meet the requirements of the present. So that's kind of like one reason we want real-time anecdotal data. The second reason is that we also want to go for a wider distributed capture. So we don't want to run with volunteer databases. And there's a wider criticism here of participative action research in government labs in general, which is coming through anthropology, which is that they generally attract the usual suspects, the people who want to tell a story, and the people whose parents encourage them to tell a story or even type it for them. I noticed that one, that was rather good. But fundamentally, one of the issues for me is how do we get a representative sample? So how do we hear the voices of the people who are normally voiceless, who wouldn't come on and contribute within those public environments, or would see telling a story as a performance issue? Because if you ask somebody to tell a story, you set expectations. If you ask them to record an observation, it is kind of like very different. And then I think the third major issue in terms of our work is that we're concerned about curation in terms of the way it provides cultural filters. So the power in narrative work is not to tell the story, it's who interprets the story or who selects it or who indexes it, which is where the real power exists. So one of the works we've been doing on, which ironically is based on work I started in Kakadu in the 70s, is to basically focus people on self-interpretation, so that the power of interpretation of the narrative goes to the person who creates it. And there we need to move beyond text, and that was a point made by this previous speaker as well. So when we're capturing material, we capture photographs or voice or text or any combination of that. So the basic principle is self-interpreted anecdotal observation on a distributed network, and very quickly. So let me give you a couple of wider examples of this, and then I'll focus on the COVID work. So one of the things you may or may not know, you're in New South Wales, I come from South Wales, is Wales is the only country in the world to have passed what's called the Future Generations Act. And that's an act of the Welsh Parliament, used to be called the Senedd, is now called the Senedd, used to be called the Welsh Assembly. We finally got our own language back in naming our own institutions, which basically requires any legislation passed in Wales to take into account the needs of the next generation. So that's an act of the Senedd. It's got a commissioner designed to enforce it. And it's designed to prevent short-term political decisions in terms of long-term political decisions, in terms of the needs of that next generation. So as part of that, and also in Colombia and Sweden and elsewhere, and one abortive attempt down in near Adelaide, which has never really taken off, but we'd like to reactivate that. But successful projects in Wales, Sweden, Colombia, and also Egypt and Pakistan, is to use children as ethnographers to their community. Because what we want to do is to see the past, present, and future through the eyes of those whose future it is. And so making people journalists as well as journal keepers is a large part of what we do. So on some of the seminal work on this in South Wales, we got people who are known as hoodies, i.e. people who would never contributed to a website or would never actually come to a PAR, a participative action research workshop or a lab or anything like that. But because it was part of their sports club or their community centre or their school project, became journalists to people within their community. And then we also did something very pioneering in that we coupled young people with old people. This is called transgenerational pairing. And there's some sound reasons behind this in terms of neuroplasticity. So basically we would teach young people how to use the software, but only if they brought somebody from their grandparents' generation to work with them and come up with small scale micro interventions which will make a difference in the field. And I've seen too many youth parliaments to take them too seriously because they end up with everybody coming up with idealistic ideas. Adults celebrate it, publish it, and then nothing changes. And you end up with a disillusioned generation. What we've actually found is by coupling young people with their not their grandparents, but their grandparents' generation, is you get the network wisdom of older people combined with the brilliance of younger people, the ideas of younger people. And then if they come up with novel ideas, we put them into a trio with somebody from government who can make those ideas happen. So for me, narrative work is not just about reflection and memory. It's about changing things in a near real time. So to come on to some of the COVID work we're doing, we're currently deployed in the NHS, and just to be clear, these things can be deployed now as packages anywhere in the world. So if somebody's interested, get in touch. And I see that Viv Reed is on the list, who's one of our key network members, so you can get in touch with Viv as well. There's several things that we're actually doing. So one is we've deployed app-based journals into medical frontline workers. Because what we actually want is for people to capture lessons as they do things. And with that, we've got a more like this feature, because we've discovered, we thought initially we'd have to use interns to get stories from doctors in the crisis, but it turned out they wanted to hear other stories like theirs, in return for which they would put material in. But again, this is more anecdotal observation. And that is based on what we originally did with the US Army in Afghanistan, where basically we replaced patrol reports with real-time data, observation data from company commanders. And the capacity of company commanders to gather the observations of other company commanders like them. And that was based on original work in Iraq, which showed that in the field under fire, people were prepared to pay attention to blogs of other people like them, but not to pay attention to doctrine or reflected learning. They wanted uncurated raw material, and they didn't want it as a single story, they wanted it as a collection of anecdotes. And that links in with a key cognitive neuroscience thing called conceptual blending, The way we make decisions is we blend together fragmented memories together with our current observations and come up with a decision. And in evolutionary terms, that's very sensible. So that's kind of like one element. And that means we got material coming in real time from people who are making the hard decisions, who are reflecting on that and learning on it. But we can integrate that data across multiple observers in real time. And we can combine it with data, say physical data from blood pressure monitors, aeration, and so on. It's that combination of the two which matters. The second thing, which we're just starting up in Scotland, is to look at people who are in semi-permanent lockdown, because the mental health implications of those are significant. So we've done several things there. One is by effectively triggering a program for schools in which a teacher identifies a group of pupils and also their parents. And those combination of interaction through the software gives us direct data on what's actually going on in homes. And we're interested in hearing what's called weak signal collections, i.e. the early identification of preconditions, not only for mental health, but for the growing pattern of abuse and narcissistic control, which we're starting to see as a result of lockdown. And again, we've done some pioneering work on that in the UK and in Australia and Nova Scotia, on understanding the narrative structures of people who've gone through an abuse cycle and have come out of the other end of it. Yeah. So that sort of narrative from the home, but using schools as a trigger mechanism is another key one. And then we've also been looking at the whole issue about well-being, and one of the key themes in the EU handbook on complexity and chaos management, is that you need to learn by engagement, and you need to start to focus on understanding where your workforce are. But by asking them traditional structured questionnaires, they kind of like know what they're meant to say. So our approach is very different. We move into engaging them in real-time situational assessment and what's called micro-scenario planning. So they're engaged in understanding the future of the organization and in collective assessment of the present. But through that, we can also incidentally gather indications of how well they are, the weak signal detection and all that sort of stuff. And that's kind of like the final theme, which I really wanted to go into before I shut up and hand on to the next speaker. This concept of communication by engagement and understanding things indirectly is critical. I remember one program we ran in Ohio where we were looking at obesity in children. And this ironically was a project funded by Victoria's Secret. I'm still recovering from that, but they fund everything in Ohio. So basically what we actually did there was to get children to act as ethnographers to adults who were obese. And the fact that they investigated the problem, the fact we gave them agency, we didn't lecture them, meant that they then changed their own eating habits because they could see the consequences, but they worked it out for themselves. So you've got to be careful, there's a whole body of work here. The other thing is that explicit tags means that people just replicate old patterns. They don't see novelty. And I haven't got time to go into it now, but there's some material available online I can give you. We've just spent the last 3 years working on a complexity-based approach to design thinking, because the whole design thinking lab things has become a commodity in which the results are quite easy to predict. So we've been working on an approach which mimics biology, in which we can map existing knowledge assets against currently unarticulated needs. Now, in terms of coming out of the pandemic, that's going to work in a very, very different way. And so my final thought here is, part of my background is a mixed degree in physics and philosophy. From a physics perspective, no social scientist ever has enough data to form any valid conclusion. So what we're trying to do is to get the sort of evidence base by mass observation and mass participation without direct explicit tagging and without curation, which allows us to create the objectivity of numbers combined with the persuasive power of people's lived experiences. And as I say, there's a package of that stuff available for COVID now, but it's part of a wider issue in terms of how do we understand society, how do we deal with things like global warming, How do we collect global warming with COVID-19, with Black Power Matters? All of these things are joined up in people's lived experiences, and we need to start to treat it as such. So at that point, I finished. Oh, and the mugs are Starbucks City mugs, by the way, in response to the questions. Yeah, and that's a third of the collection. It goes on around the next two walls.